Okay. So yes, remote sensing is this process, right? It's collecting information without being in physical contact. So this is an analogy for remote sensing, our human perceptual process, right? This is when you look at people as a form of remote sensing. You're not actually sticking your eyeball. You're not in physical contact. So question, why does a ripe apple look red in sunlight? Those who you do physics, you know this. It's because we see the red, orange, yellow, green, blue. We see in that spectrum, and a red apple looks red because it's reflecting the red wavelengths, and all the other wavelengths are being absorbed, right? Why are leaves green? Well, it's the same idea, right? It's reflecting the green and absorbing all the other wavelengths in the visible. So healthy vegetation in ordinary sunlight looks green because basically red and blue wavelengths are being absorbed. And the reason for that is because of photosynthesis and chlorophyll, but I don't have time to talk about that. An unhealthy leaf, which doesn't look red, it doesn't look green, basically it's reflecting most of the visible wavelengths similarly, and sometimes kind of there's more yellow in this example. So I used to be into Star Trek, which really dates me now because no one watches Star Trek, not even the movies. But in Star Trek, there was a guy called Lieutenant Jody LaForge, and he had this visor. He was born blind, and he used to say, "My visor enables me to see the entire electromagnetic spectrum from infrared to ultraviolet." And this is a question I'd ask undergraduates: why is this visor not so great, really? And the answer is we only see in the visible. We only see, like this. So bees, for example, see in the ultraviolet. And so the reason why when they made this TV series in the 60s, this or 70s, it was kind of stupid is because why would you have an advanced technology which you could only see in the infrared and the ultraviolet, like a bee? You want to be able to see in all the wavelengths. There's the visible and the ultraviolet is tiny. The visible wavelength range is like a fraction of the width of a human hair, a hundredth or something. So we'd like to be able to see in all these wavelengths, and you know um, most remote sensing satellites run from zero point 0.4 micron, which is the ultraviolet, to about 14 micron, which is over here, which is in the infrared for measuring temperature. And satellite remote sensing systems, just like our human perceptual process, are collecting information about an object, in other words, the surface, without being in physical contact with that object. And the source they use, unless we're using radar and LiDAR, which I'm not going to talk about, is the sun, all right? So there has been lots of satellites launched with sensors specifically designed to look at the Earth's surface. And the first one that we talk about was launched by NASA in 1972. It was called Landsat 1. And then this figure here, it's hard to see. It's a bit of an eye chart, but this says 1972. This is time up to, it's a bit old now, 2011. But these are all sensors. The vertical length of these bars is the lifetime of the sensor. Most sensors for putting in space have a lifetime of 5 to 7 years. Landsat 5, which is this one here, was an exception. It lasted 29 years. And that was because the engineers kept it alive. It's in the Guinness Book of Records as being the longest satellite. We think very often in simplistic ways when we talk about satellites and remote sensing, we think about their orbits. And their orbit, if you know anything about orbital mechanics, there's just two parameters. It's the altitude, which is based related to the launch velocity, and the inclination. And we talk about, for environmental remote sensing, looking at the Earth's surface for environmental reasons, we do it from LEO, low Earth orbit, and geostationary, which is a very specific orbit. And the one in the middle, MEO, that's really military satellites, which we don't have time to talk about. And they're special orbits because there's particular problems to do with the Van Allen belt. If you're a physicist, you know what that is. So this is a geostationary image. This is a European Mediasat second generation. This is basically, it's in geostationary orbits, which means the satellite is over the equator and it rotates exactly the same speed as the Earth rotates, and it can take images every 5 minutes of the full disk, but the size of the resolution of the imagery is not that high. This is MODIS, which is a satellite I work on, which I'll tell you about in a moment. This is a low Earth orbit, so this has an altitude of 705 kilometers. Obviously, here we are. This is Michigan. This is sometime in the winter. This is like true colors. It's red, green, blue. And you can see Lake Michigan. You can see lake effect snow, you can see clouds, blah, 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 blah. It's kind of cool, actually. It looks like, look at this lake effect snow effect, right? All this stuff here, over Western Michigan, it's like a fractal thing, isn't it? It looks like your car windscreen, it's the same thing, but it's from space. Nowadays, we have commercial satellite data. So the Skybox is a company that was now been bought by another company, but this is 90 centimeter resolution from space. This is just an animation I like to show because it shows the Burning Man festival in Nevada desert as they build the camp out. So it's quite, this stuff, 90 centimeters. Here's Burning Man. If you've never been to Burning Man, you should probably go, because it's kind of a big hippie art festival, but very interesting technology stuff there too. And those data are expensive, that you have to buy it, right? It costs money. But high resolution data, which I'm going to talk about again at the end of this presentation, is now becoming very active and interesting. And you can infer human activity from high resolution data. So if you work for the military, you can basically say the hatch is open, they're refueling, or they're loading bombs. Luggage trailers could be bombs, right? So there's lots of interest in that. This is just a recap on satellite remote sensing, but before we talk about my research. So how do we get satellite data, all this data, how do we get it down to the ground? And so usually, if you're an engineer, you'll understand this. We use a satellite receiving station. This is a picture I took in China. I went to a satellite receiving station in China. I was invited, but I went really because it was next to the Great Wall of China. It's like half an hour's drive away. So that was an excuse. But all of them I've been to in Africa, Europe, and America, they all look something like this, right? And they use X-band, which is 8 gigahertz. So they get data rates of hundreds of megabits per second. The latest thing now, though, is to use lasers. So nowadays, when they get the data, and this is the ground system, and I showed you in China. So if you're in a low Earth orbit like MODIS or Skybox, you're going over the poles about every 90 to 100 minutes, depending on the altitude. And so you've got to get the information that you sense of the Earth's surface. Think of a camera. You've got to get it to the ground. And so as the ground system, you've only got a certain moments in time to get the data down. And so what they often have is what these called relay satellites. These are geostationary satellites. So basically the LEO sends the signal up to the geostationary, and the geostationary satellite can then send it down to the ground. That's the way around it. Oh, it's written down here in yellow. European Space Agency launched the first laser-based mechanism for getting data to the ground, which is changing things very rapidly, and that's very needed for the commercial sector. So it's a bit like going to 5G, for wireless. So when we think about information from satellite data, most people in the environmental sector are interested in geophysical variables like temperature, albedo, or vegetation, or what class is there, and stuff like that. How do we get that from remote sensing? We talk about spectral, spatial, temporal, angular, and polarization. I'm going to talk real quickly about the first four. If you're a STEM kind of scientist, you know what polarization is as well. But for the sake of a short talk, I'm not going to talk about it. So this is commercial data. This was the first commercial satellite data that was available. They used to cost $1,500 for one of these little images. This is called Iconos. It was launched in 1999. This is over the United States Department of Agriculture Research Center. On the left-hand side is red, green, blue reflectance. And on the right-hand side, it's the same, but there's near infrared as well, which is a wavelength that we do not see in. And what you can see here is in the visible, these are trees. This is agriculture. All the trees look the same, but in the near infrared, you see the darker trees. They're coniferous trees. The lighter trees are deciduous. So you can start to get the sense of using the spectral information. You can actually ascertain what's happening in the surface or in the atmosphere or in the soils. So this is a plot of reflectance against wavelength. And so we see humans, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, this very small part of the spectrum. So this is the spectra. The green one is green grass, which is why green reflectance is quite high, because leaves are green, right? The red and the blue are absorbed. And so these are typical spectra for other types of surface properties like dry grass, light soil, aluminium. And these are spectra for lots of different types of vegetation. They're all different. So those spectral differences you can use if you've got enough bands, if you've got enough examples in the x-axis, you can try and understand and map automatically with computers what the land cover is. So this is a MODIS image of the whole world on one day. You take a year's worth of data like that and you can make a land cover map. So this is actually a satellite product. So there are 17 classes where every 500-meter pixel, obviously this is generalized, this is the whole planet, is classified into what they think is there. And the way that was done is like a supervised training algorithm using this kind of concept. The other type of information you can get from satellite data, but most people don't use it, is spatial information. So this is an airborne photograph, but you can do the same with commercial data. And so you can see kind of texture, you can see like the crop lines. So spatial information has information in it. So this is basically somewhere in Kenya. This is actually declassified spy satellite data, but it doesn't really matter. The tree density is different, so you can kind of measure the texture. So you can do something called a semi-variogram, which is like the autocorrelation as a function of lag. It doesn't really matter. You can, oh, it's got horrible noise effects. But you can actually use the variogram to kind of like work out different tree densities. An obvious one is temporal information. I said Landsat 1972. We've a whole series of Landsat sensors, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And so you can, you know, this is a famous picture made by the United States Geological Survey of Las Vegas in 1973. And then, you know, in the between then and the 1990s, very massive urbanization, and it continued going, right? So the landscape, you know, the desert is being replaced by, you know, people living there. Another example of temporal information is this is a time series of the Larsen ice sheet in Antarctica when it broke, right? Its size about, I think it was the size of Rhode Island, 3,250 square kilometers of the ice sheet just carved off in a month. So this is you showing the carving off through time. So that's temporal information, change detection, which I'm going to talk about a bit more as well. Temporal information also, this is somewhere in the outback in Australia. This is an estimate of the temperature, the skin temperature in the morning from a satellite and in the afternoon. So in Australia, as it gets hotter in the afternoon, you can see the temperature change. So the other one, which I just put in because I think it's fun, but it's complicated, is this idea if you look at the surface from different angles, or if the sun's in a different position, it looks different. And there's actually information within that. There's information. So this is actually not a satellite image. This is an airborne image, but looking straight down, looking to the left, you see it looks brighter than on the right. And that's because on the left, what we're seeing from the airplane is reflectance. These green things are trees. The sun is behind the airplane, and so it looks a lot brighter simply because all the shadows, which you see on the right hand side, are hidden. We call that BRDF. There's been a bunch of satellites that look at that explicitly. There was a very cool one. It was a one-off experimental one that NASA launched called MISA, which had 9 cameras. So it looked at nine angles, and it had this really cool design. So the satellite is going over in a low Earth orbit at about, I think it's about 7 kilometers a second. And it's got this the camera system on the left points and tilts. So the same location is always sensed from a slightly different angle. So this is Florida and Cuba. If it works, there you go. There are the 9 looks. So you can actually see things like sun glint. You can see how the surface changes. This satellite was actually made for retrieving information about what's in the atmosphere, but I don't have time to talk about that. So right now, NASA, which is the premier space agency, there's also NOAA, which is the meteorological agency, but I won't talk about it, don't have time, has all these satellites in orbit. So MODIS, the one I was talking about, is on Terra and Aqua, which were launched in these years. Landsat 7, there's Landsat 1 I talked about. Landsat 7 was in 1999. Landsat 8 was launched a few years ago. I'll show you a picture of the launch in a moment. And there's a bunch of other, and they all do different things. Meanwhile, our rivals really is the European Space Agency. They have a very different set of This is a fairly recent slide. They have a bunch of satellites as well. So, you know, just to put it into context, the federal budget for NASA, it's about 0.5%. NASA gets 0.5% of the federal budget. Of that 0.5%, they probably spend 10 to 20% on this kind of stuff. But Landsat 8, for example, here, that cost $1 billion to launch and build and maintain. So it's a lot of money, a lot of investment from America in these observatory systems, and similarly from the European Space Agency. There are other agencies. Japan has one, India has one, etc., etc. But America and Europe lead the way, and they all have this idea of taking all this raw data and turning it into knowledge products. So on the left hand side, this is like satellite data, and on the right hand side, this is knowledge. So like if you want the weather forecast, or you want to know what the crop status is. So this is kind of what a lot of the agencies are now trying to do. They're trying to make like a weather forecast, which by the way is from satellite data, but do that for other things to extract information. And let me just say, it's not like NASA just says, hey, what should we do today? They actually have a series of strategies. They have a research strategy, an education strategy, a technology strategy, a data management strategy. But all of this is driven by what they call science roadmaps. There's about 7 of them. So for example, it's fairly old now. This is the roadmap for understanding the world's carbon ecosystems and biochemistry. There's a series of questions. These are these questions here, and then they try and work, then from those questions they try and work out what satellites with what capabilities should be launched. So North America's carbon budget quantified starting in 2006. So, you know, they're trying to understand the carbon fluxes and stocks in America using lots of different types of data, but including satellite data. So the point there is just to say that it's not the space agencies, particularly in America, they do a very good job of launching satellites to address specific questions. The commercial sector does not. The commercial sector is all about launching satellites to make money, to sell imagery, right? Which I'll talk about in a moment. So as I said at the beginning, when I came to America in 1996, I moved to DC because I wanted to work at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. NASA has a series of big centers. The big 2 is the one on the East Coast is Goddard, who was a famous rocket scientist. And the one on the West Coast is in Pasadena in California. It's called Jet Propulsion Lab. Jet Propulsion Lab mainly does things like Mars. It mainly does astrophysics, but they do some Earth observation. Goddard Space Flight Center does the majority of the Earth observation. So I came to America because I got this amazing job offer to work on a satellite called MODIS. I showed you an image. Remember the one of Michigan already before it launched, and it was kind of cool. And it launched in 1999 and 2002. And there was a science team, there still is. That's me at the back. I'm looking a lot younger. And some of these guys are very famous, or, you know, this is Steve Running from University of Montana, very famous biochemical modeler. John Townsend, University of Maryland, etc., etc., etc. So what the science team does, this shouldn't say 18 years, it should say 20 years. What they did was they were mainly university groups. Each group was responsible for making a product. They wrote the software, the algorithm, and then the product was made operationally at Goddard. It still is. It's for 20 years now. They've been doing this operationally. Every day they make a product. And I had 2 jobs. One job was to check out all of these products and make sure they work correctly, which I'm not going to talk about. But I got bored of doing that. And so I became a part of the fire and burnt area group. And so there's a MODIS product that maps globally burnt area, which is now what I'm going to talk to you about. And that's obviously very important. This is a MODIS image, just to give you the scale. That's California. I don't know if you remember, there was a very, very awful campfire in Woolsey Fire a few years ago. Woolsey Fire was just north of LA. That's LA there. Campfire was up here. Like a bunch of people died, a lot of loss of life. But also, all this stuff here, this is smoke, right? All this is greenhouse gases. This is incredibly important for quantifying the carbon cycle. and understanding the role of vegetation fires and global warming. And is global warming increasing? Yes. Are fires increasing in their intensity and severity and extent? Yes. Is that linked? Probably. What can we do about it? Don't know yet. So 20 years of burnt area data. It maps. So this is a product that I developed the algorithm for. It's run at Goddard on a big computing system. So it maps 500 meters globally on an operational basis, whether a location burnt or not. So let me just take it back a second. The algorithm. So this is a photograph I took from a helicopter. This is a helicopter boom. It was cool. It was in Northern Australia. We were doing field work in Australia. The helicopter pilot was crazy. He was so relaxed. He was like, yeah, just lean out and take a picture, no problem. And it was kind of dangerous, but he didn't seem to care. This is a tree. That's a dead tree that's burned. That's white ash. But most of this landscape is this black stuff. It's black char. So most fires, they leave charcoal. There's my foot. This is a Keynes. That's my foot, kind of just to give you a sense of the scale. So this dark stuff is what is the signal that we can look for. So this is actually a pixel, a single 500-meter pixel from MODIS for nearly a year in Australia. And this variation is due to that thing I showed you about that angular problem, which I'm called BRDF. I don't want to talk about it. Sometimes you have gaps, which is a problem for detecting the change. And then this is when a fire occurred. So what happens in the near infrared in this wavelength, which we don't see in, the reflectance drops a lot over charcoal, right? In the near infrared, it just drops. If you measure charcoal in the near infrared, it drops. And so what you get is this distinct kind of drop, and then you get this recovery as the charcoal is blown away by the elements like wind and rain. But also vegetation grows back. And so what we're trying to do is use this kind of drop and this persistence to detect the burn. And the way we do it, the algorithm is this is a cartoon. The y-axis is reflectance. It could be near infrared. We don't just use one band, we use a bunch of bands, but this is to simplify it. So this is real data. This is a cartoon, it's simplified. We use a model to model, it's like a regression, if you like, but it's not. But let's just pretend it's a regression. So we use like 16 days of MODIS observations. We do a regression so we can predict on the following day what the reflectance will be, and then we compare it to what the reflectance is, and if there's not much change relative to the noise in the prediction, which is the vertical bar, it's probably not a change, and if there is, like on this occasion, there's a big change, we can apply a threshold. So this is an animation showing kind of the looping through 5 months, showing the product in Botswana. This is the Okavango Delta, which is the largest inland water delta in the world. This is about 800 kilometers across. It's a very cool place to visit if you're into looking at birds and things. And so the colors show the day of burning. So you can see this kind of change detection concept where the red is later in the 5-month period. So that was MODIS, and I've been working on MODIS, and I still do. I'm part of the MODIS science team, but I'm also part of the Landsat science team. So this was a picture that was taken not by me, but I was at the launch of Landsat 8 in 2013. Most of the US satellites are launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is kind of on the west coast in California, quite near a place called Solvang. Never go to Solvang; it's a terrible place, but the launch place is cool. And it's cool when you go to a satellite launch. The people that go there a lot, they always say the same thing: don't take a picture, because when it happens, it's like 3 seconds. I mean, if you stand there with a camera, you miss it. You literally miss it. So I didn't. This was a professional photograph, and we were a lot closer actually, but it looks a bit. I don't know. So Landsat science team. This is the day after the launch. That's me. We all had hangovers because it was a successful launch, and we were told it was successful. So we all went to the bar. So this is a bunch of scientists. Some of them are international. This guy's from Australia. This guy's from Canada. But most of them are from the US, from universities or from NASA. I'm the co-lead of the Landsat science team. And I was asked to make a picture real quick. So in my lab, we made a picture, and it was on Slate, which was a blog. One of the weirdest portraits of the United States I've ever seen. And it was funny because I felt that was a bit unfair because we just put this together real quick. So this white stuff is clouds, but these are different orbits of Landsat. It's in a low Earth orbit that we talked about. So right now we're in a really exciting time because we've got MODIS, and that's been going for 20 years. Landsat 1 was launched in 1972. Landsat 7 was launched in 1999. Landsat 8, the one I just showed you the picture of, was launched in 2013. Most of these modern Landsats have a lifetime of about 6 years. European Space Agency, ESA, have launched Sentinel-2A and 2B, and Sentinel-2A and 2B are very similar. We call it the sister satellite of Landsat. When the European Space Agency launches satellites, they do it from French Guiana, which is near the equator, because it's cheaper. You need less energy to put it into orbit. So this is a different project I'm working on, but I'll just show you anyway. This is Landsat 8 in Chiang Rai in Thailand. We're looking at fields, and this is Sentinel-2A. And so what's cool about this European satellite, it's very similar to Landsat, but it's got higher spatial resolution. So this is 30 megapixels from Landsat, Sentinel-2A 10 megapixels. So it's neat, but it's very similar. And we even managed to get the two sensors calibrated. They actually, before they launched, they put the sensors together and calibrated them pre-launch. So I was talking about burnt area mapping with MODIS. And one of the problems we have with burnt area mapping at 500 meters is we just miss a lot of small fires. And so a lot of people that do emissions estimation for global warming, they're really interested in how much is missed. And so I have a project funded by NASA where we're using Landsat 8 data in conjunction with Sentinel-2A, which is European Space Agency data. We integrate them, we do a lot of pre-processing, and we map what's burnt. So we're now doing 30-meter burnt area mapping globally, or we're trying to start to think about how do we do that. Initially, we've just done it for Africa. So this is Kafue National Park in Zambia, which is a cool place to visit. This is Landsat 8 on day 155, and this is like 9 days later. So you can see all that stuff is burnt. And then this is our algorithm, which is similar to the MODIS algorithm, which maps what burnt. And so this is the whole of Africa for 1 month. So this is the 30-meter burnt area mapping. So what we were doing with MODIS, this is MODIS, the most recent MODIS 500-meter product for a lot of Africa. That's Lake Kariba in Zambia. This is Lake Malawi. This is the at 30-meter, right? This is an immense area, guys. This is huge. You'll call all the way across Africa. It's like going all the way across the US. This is like called the burning continent for a good reason. But what you can see is the two products that are completely independent have similar pattern. But what we see in the 30-meter data is a lot more burnt area, which is what we would expect to see. So a lot of people are interested in this kind of stuff. The problem is, as scientists, we're expected to be able to say how good it is. And that's a really challenging. How do you validate this? How do you say how good this is? I like going to Africa and doing field work. This is a picture of taken from a drone that some colleagues from Europe were flying. This is me. It's the back of me. And this is in Kruger National Park in South Africa. You can't see it, but there was a guy with a gun standing in this tree who's called a game guard, because there's a lot of literally lions walking around and they got to protect you. So we work with the South African Scientific Services to do this work. And then on the ground, it was an international team. This is a Brazilian student. This is a European scientist. It's Italian scientist. The other thing we try to do is use these things. These are called terrestrial lidars. They shoot a lidar at the ground. So this is before and after the fire, like a LiDAR point cloud. And we were hoping we could use it, but it's useless, guys. It's useless. There's no way we can validate a product like this. How reliable is this? How the hell are we going to do that with drones? All this. We just wanted to have a good time in Kruger, to be honest. But, so what we decided to do is, I was at a presentation, a meeting, and, I showed you this slide already. I talked earlier about commercial satellite data. There's a company called Planet that has 180 sensors called PlanetScope in a constellation. And I was at an early meeting. We invited them to come and give a presentation. And the guy, he showed this animation here, right? He said, this is in Tanzania or Tanzania, depending on where you come from. This is like a time sequence. This is 3-meter data from space. 3 meters, right? It's near daily. It's nearly every day globally. You see on the left the constellation. That's an animation, actually. but it's kind of slow. So this starts a bit later. I don't know why. But this animation here, he said to the audience, "What is this?" And we were like, "I don't know." He goes, "Yeah, but what's this thing here? What is it?" Right? And we were like, "I don't know." And it's wildebeest. The wildebeest migrate in East Africa, right? And he said it's the wildebeest. They eat all the grass, and that's what we're seeing there, right? And I was like, wow, if you can do that, if you can measure changing grass, the amount of grass, there you go. That's the planet scope. There's 180 of those guys now. They keep launching new ones. Then we can use it for burnt area validation. So we don't need to do this kind of, even though it's fun, we don't need to do that. We just need to get PlanetScope data. So I got a project to start looking at PlanetScope data. So just to give you an idea of the scale, this is 6.4 by 6 kilometers somewhere in South Africa. That's an hour and a half apart. So it's 2 overpasses of this 3-meter data. It's amazing, right? Look at that. And that's an hour and a half difference. And you can see, like I was talking about inferring land, human activity. Look, you can see the pivot irrigation. That's like an arm that goes around in a circle and puts water on the ground. You can see it in an hour and a half. You can see the thing moving, right? You can also see, if you look in the middle here, you see that that's trees. You can see the shadows changing, right? Because in an hour and a half, the position of the sun changes. We grabbed all the metadata for a year just to have a look at how much data they've got and the sensors. So this is 1 day of one sensor type. And here's another, the same day, a different sensor type and a different sensor type. So we basically, in a 12-month period, that company at 3-meter resolution is getting, on average, over land, about 269 observations per year. That's like nearly a day, 1.3 day. Every 1.3 days, they get an image, right? That's amazing, right? Now, the problem is, what I didn't say is when I talked about this, the information content in satellite data, when we do things like MODIS and the Landsat Sentinel-2 burnt area mapping, we're using lots of wavelengths. We're using red, green, blue, near infrared, red edge, SWIR. We're using like 9 wavelengths to get the information. When you go to this PlanetScope, all they've got is that. They've got red, green, blue. They've also got a near infrared. Some of the latest PlanetScopes have another band, but it doesn't really matter. There's not much spectral information. So we're forced to try and use spatial information. And so the thing that now everyone is doing in all sectors of science, it doesn't matter if you're doing biology or remote sensing or astrophysics, everyone is now doing this thing called machine learning, right? Now, machine learning in my world used to be things like random forest and regression, which is up here on the top right. So in that, what you do is you just get lots of examples of something, and then you make a statistical classification. And the thing that's revolutionized everything literally in the last 5 years is this thing called deep learning. So deep learning, it's the same idea. You have examples which you label, and then you give it to this neural network. And the deep learning is a particular type of architecture, and it will be able to make guesses and predictions and detections. So when you have a cell phone and you use your face to open the phone up, right? You know, you can do facial recognition to open your phone, right? That's actually a deep learning technology, right? And so we've basically are now using deep learning to map burn areas, and it really irritates me because I'm a old school remote sensing guy that understands all the physics of remote sensing, but now that's irrelevant. So this was a Brazilian postdoc's work that this is brand new. He sent me it this morning. This is PlanetScope imagery. This is 3-meter data somewhere in the world because we've got a lot of data now. And then this is the day 2 days later. So you can see the burns, right? This is 3-meter. Those little red dots, they're bushes, right? And then he used a deep learning algorithm. We got loads and loads of examples, which we labeled. And then we just gave it to the deep learning algorithm to classify. And that's what was classified by the deep learning algorithm as what burned between those 2 dates. Now, it kind of works. We were really surprised. And just for comparison, this is the MODIS, that 500-meter product, right? Which is based on lots of bands, very old school, running out of NASA. Yeah. And so 500 meters versus 3 meters, but it works. Here's another example. This is 3-meter PlanetScope data. 2 days later, you see the burns. You also see on the left, see this left, there's 2 images here. This is atmospheric problems, which I don't have time to talk about. That's the deep learning algorithm to map what burned between those 2 dates. There's MODIS. It's you know, insert word here, but it's really good. It works really well. We're really pleased. So we're trying to write this up at the moment. So to finish, what's going to happen in the future is we're going to have what's already happening in remote sensing. Satellite remote sensing is this idea of integrating different sensors together. This is an old slide, but I've already showed you it using Landsat from NASA, USGS, and using Sentinel from European Space Agency, just putting them together. That's now really where a lot of work is now going. The other thing that's really happening is the commercialization of space. Historically, it costs about $10,000 to get a pound into orbit. So just do the math. How heavy are you? How much do you weigh? Multiply by that $10,000. That's how much it would cost minimum to get you into orbit on a commercial or a NASA to fly you up. And so there are now, this slide's a bit out of date actually, but there are now all these companies that are in the space business of trying to get stuff. So, you know, the Tesla guy, Elon Musk's company, they're now commercially resupplying the International Space Station. The first one was in 2012. NASA doesn't even do that. NASA used to run the space shuttle to get up to the International Space Station. They don't do it. They've given it to the commercial sector because the commercial sector, they're trying to get the cost of getting a pound into space to about $1,000. How much do you weigh? $1,000? You could even afford to go yourself. You know, Richard Branson's company is doing that next year, right? Tourists can go to space. So things means that we can launch satellites, which is what's happening. You know, the PlanetScope, there's 180 of those satellites in space right now. The other thing that's happening is computing that's really changing. I put this up because I think it's hilarious. When I was you guys' aged, you know, when I was 20, about 35 years ago, this is what I did my PhD on Cambridge University. Where I did my PhD. I had this thing called an I²S, and it's an antique now, but it was I found it in INPE, which is the Brazilian space agency. I was visiting them, and they had it in their corridor as, here's a historical relic, how we used to do things. And I was looking at it, and I was like, man, that's my baby. I love that machine. I spent years on that. So those buttons on the left, you literally, when you wanted to load an image up, you had to hit a button, click, load image. I mean, there was no software interface. It was really clunky. And then until relatively recently, if you had a lot of money from NASA research money, you could use these high performance computing systems. This was called Pleiades, which is at NASA owns in San Francisco. And at the time, it was in what's called the top 10. So they used to have, they still do a list of the fastest computers in the world, and it was like number 10 or something. But then now they've got new ones. And of course, when I moved to MSU, I use the ISO, which is this, you know, some of you probably use that. It's pretty cool. So we have like a buy-in, we have a lot of compute nodes on the ISO. And so that's changing. But really what's really happening right now in all sectors is cloud computing. And so the problem for remote sensing people when they do cloud computing is cloud computing is awesome, right? Netflix is cloud computing, right? You probably knew that, right? But when you want to do remote sensing and you want to like process data in the cloud, you need the data in the cloud, and that's where it gets hard, putting the data into the cloud. So there are people that are now doing that. Google inevitably is doing that. So a colleague of mine who's on the Landsat science team is called Noel Garlick. He's in charge of this thing called Google Earth Engine. And basically they've copied all the world's satellite data. This is classic Google. We just did it. We just copied all the world's satellite data into the Google cloud. And for now, you can go in and write scripts and make products yourself for free for now, but you know they're going to commercialize it. And so I think I think that's interesting. And the last thing I'd like to say is, because you're undergraduates, the field of remote sensing and geoscience and computing, extracting information, it's really hot. There's a lot of jobs. I just did this just before this talk. This actually is a postdoc position that I have advertised, by the way. So I just wanted to check if it was there. But look, I just put into Indeed, which is a basic website for jobs, remote sensing, 1,455 jobs open, right? There's a shortage of people that work in that field right now. And that most of those jobs, these are actually postdocs, but Many of those jobs are in industry and they pay quite well. So questions? Questions?
I guess I'll go ahead and ask one real quick. So I'm coming from a forestry background myself, and I know there's at least one graduate student in the MSU forestry department who's using LiDAR to try and gather information about forest stands and, you know, height and canopy cover and that sort of thing. Do you see any future relevancy of LiDAR in conjunction with satellite sensing?
Yeah, so here's some backup slides because when I was doing this talk, I was doing it last minute. I had a master's student here. We were using terrestrial lidar. It's this thing. This is the engineer that built it, right? And we were measuring. We were using terrestrial laser scanner to measure grass, right, and see if we could do it rapidly. And we also, I had a student, Brazilian student, using lidar. These red guys are lidar transects, right? These are airborne lidar. Oh, of course, all of the green thing is the Brazilian legal Amazon. See at the top right, it's a huge area. And this is lidar data. So this is an animation he made of the tops of the trees. So right now, so this is like the same thing. This is a sentinel image. This is a lidar transect. This is like the tree heights. So there's a lot of interest. Colleagues of mine at University of Maryland just published a paper where they used LiDAR data from a satellite called JEDI, which is a spaceborne LiDAR, the first one that's specifically looking at vegetation, to make a global tree height map using Landsat and LiDAR. So yeah, and Irv, who's one of my currently my only PhD student, his PhD thesis is on using LiDAR, and we're looking at mapping tree heights and biomass in the Congo in Africa. And there's a satellite called JEDI. The guy who's in charge of it, the principal investigator, is into Star Wars. So it's called JEDI, which is a great name. Global Ecosystems Dynamics, something or other. But that's a proof of concept. I know him quite well. He spent the last 20 years trying to get a LiDAR in space, not just an airborne one. And so JEDI doesn't work that well. Irv and I are just about to submit a paper. In fact, this evening I'm going to submit it on some problems with JEDI. But in principle, it's going to be huge, LiDAR, right? But there's a lot of issues with it. It's very immature technology, but it's going to be huge. LiDAR is going to be really big. I believe the big problem with LiDAR is you've got to know where the ground is, because it gives you you can get a return off it. You can kind of get, basically LiDAR gives you the three-dimensional structure, but there's a lot of technological issues. And I think if you confuse it with radar or something, it's going to be amazing. I have slides, I don't have them on me, where I show using airborne LiDAR to map building heights in cities. I mean, it's used regularly. I was at a meeting recently where the Finnish Forest Agency in Finland, they fly all of Finland with LiDAR data every 2 years. All of it. And at very high resolution. So they actually know where all their trees are in Finland. They know their heights. It's amazing. And they put that in big computing and a big data system and do it, right? That's where we're going, right? That's a really hot area to be in, right? The trouble is with hot areas, it might be a dead end. It might not work, right? There might be some technological problems, but right now it looks really cool. Historically, the people that flew LiDAR in the US was the US Corps of Army Engineers who do all the like coastal defense and all those engineering guys. They've flown a lot of LiDAR. They're very well experienced, but now a lot of commercial companies do it, right? The other thing that's really hot is drones, which is not my thing because I use satellites, but there's a lot of information from drones, because you can get these drones now that are really quite cheap and pretty good, and you can do some cool stuff. And there's even quite simple software that you can just use. So there's a lot of stuff you can do. But LiDAR, yeah, good one. I think LiDAR is a great asset and new and very exciting from space because it's global. It's global. It's not like flying an airplane, which is very expensive. It's every day global.
Very cool. Thank you.
Questions, come on. I know you ask me anything. You can ask me about non-science stuff.
On one of the
I have two
satellites,
cats. Yeah.
sorry, on one of the satellites, you said that they had red, green, blue, and near infrared, and you said that they had one more as well that wasn't useful to you guys. What was it?
Oh, it is useful. I just didn't have time to talk about it. They, the PlanetScope satellite, they have a red edge, which is between the red band and the near infrared. And the red edge is called the red edge because when you look at the reflectance of vegetation, I showed it in the presentation, the reflectance of vegetation has this very characteristic shape. If you show me a reflectance spectra, I can tell you what I can almost always say what the thing I'm looking at is. Here you go, right? So this is the red here. This is the near infrared here. This kind of ramp here, this is called the red edge. It's the edge between the near infrared and the red. So this red edge, the slope of that, the first derivative is related to some vegetation properties. And so the PlanetScope guys, they have a red, whoops, they have a red, a green, a blue, a near infrared, and on the new sensor, they have a what's called a red edge. And they just contacted me. We just submitted a proposal with them. I'm a collaborator on a proposal where they're looking at using the shortwave infrared. The shortwave infrared is these guys over here. So there's two water absorption bands here and here. These guys dip down like this because of water absorption. But if you're looking at drought monitoring or vegetation health or stress, and having wavelengths in these areas is very helpful as well. And if you're looking at clouds and other things. So yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, I hope that was sufficiently entertaining. I didn't want to get too technical. I just thought I'd show lots of pictures. When I did I was saying to some of you guys at the beginning while we were waiting for people to come in, when I did my undergraduate degree, it was in geophysics, which is looking for oil. And the year I finished, the oil price dropped to less than $12 a barrel. So there was no work. So I decided to go and do a master's degree. You can tell from my accent, I'm from the UK. You're not going to like me. You're going to hate me when I say this. But in the UK, the government paid me to do a master's degree, right? They same with the undergraduate. I said, oh, I'll go and do a master's degree. So the government, they paid for the degree and then they gave me like $15,000 a year to live on, right? So it was like, it wasn't such a big deal to go and do a master's degree, but I did. And there was one guy who gave a lecture on remote sensing satellites, like I showed you, and he just showed all these cool pictures. I didn't understand what he was talking about, but the pictures were so cool. And I went, that's what I want to do. And that's what I ended up doing, not geophysics. So I just thought I'd make it entertaining and show some pretty pictures.